Hi, and thank you for tuning in to Gavin Lon Digital. I'm Gavin Lon. So, we are at a point where we have coded the CRUD-related code for the majority of our custom entities. We have coded the CRUD functionality for the category, category item, content, and media type entities. In this video, I'd like to focus on making a particular refinement to two arrays of views pertaining to the category item entity, namely the create and edit arrays of views. We have a datetime field named DateTimeItemReleased. Currently, a user can add data or edit data for this field through the use of the browser's default DatePicker widget on the create and edit views for the category item entity. Note that the relevant browser knows, as it were, to make the browser's default DatePicker available for the DateTimeItemReleased field because the DateTimeItemReleased field in the category item model is of type datetime. This means that the corresponding HTML code representing the DateTimeItemReleased input control will contain a type attribute set to the date value. This attribute value tells the browser, as it were, to make the browser's default DatePicker available for the relevant date field. As discussed, the default browser DatePicker will currently be presented to the user on the create and edit views for the category item entity. It is not ideal to use the default DatePicker widget like this for two reasons. Reason one is that different browsers may render their default DatePicker widget, whereby the DatePicker widget may have a different look and feel when compared to how other browsers may render their default DatePicker widget. So it is better to have a consistent look and feel across all browsers. Reason number two is that we are limited in terms of our ability to customize the relevant DatePicker widget. So, the question is, how can we address these two issues? Well, we can use a third-party DatePicker widget that has been developed to provide the appropriate versatility for customization endeavors and consistency in terms of look and feel across relevant browsers. For the prototype, I decided to implement the jQuery UI DatePicker widget, and I think this DatePicker widget does a pretty good job in addressing our needs. So, let's use the jQuery UI DatePicker widget in this video to implement a custom third-party DatePicker for the relevant fields in our web application. If you'd like to support the channel through a donation, I've included a PayPal link below in the description. You can, of course, support the channel by subscribing, and please ring the bell so that you'll be notified of future content. If you feel you're gaining value from these videos, please give these videos a thumbs up. It will be greatly appreciated, and please feel free to share these videos with anyone you feel may benefit from their content. So, the first step is to download the appropriate jQuery UI files that we'll need for integrating the jQuery UI DatePicker widget into our web application. Let's navigate to this URL. All relevant URLs are available in the description, and download the relevant files. To download the necessary files, let's press the download button on this page here. Let's open our downloads directory and extract the downloaded zip file into a directory of our choice. The next step is to copy the relevant directory containing the downloaded relevant jQuery UI files into an appropriate directory within our MVC project. So the appropriate place would be the www.root/lib directory. So let's copy the relevant jQuery UI folder we have just downloaded into the www.root/lib directory, which is part of the directory structure in our web project. The next step is to reference the relevant jQuery UI files from within the relevant layout view. So let's navigate to the new jQuery UI folder that we have now integrated into our web project. From the relevant layout view, we need to reference a jQuery UI CSS file, as well as a jQuery UI JavaScript file. Note that the relevant layout view from where we need to create our references is the one that resides in the admin area. This is because the views for the category item entity reside within the admin area. So let's create a reference for the appropriate jQuery UI CSS file. Here we have the CSS file that we need to reference. We could reference this file, but if we expand this node here, we can see that we have a minified version of this file. Minification reduces the size of the source code, making its transmission over a network, e.g. the internet, more efficient. I've included a link to a web page with more information on minification below in the description under the additional information section. So we can create a reference to this file by dragging this file onto the relevant layout view like this. Note that the reference to the relevant CSS file is made between the head tags. So here is the jQuery UI JavaScript file that we need to reference from within the relevant layout view. Let's expand the node here, and you can see that we have a minified version of the JavaScript file. So let's drag the node representing the minified version of the relevant JavaScript file to the bottom of the relevant layout view's body tag, like this. And that's it. We are now referencing the relevant jQuery UI files that we need in order to make our jQuery UI widget work within our web application. So now we should be able to leverage the jQuery UI DatePicker widget from any Razor view within the admin area. So we are first going to appropriately integrate the relevant DatePicker widget into the Create Razor view for the category item entity. So let's open the relevant Create Razor view. Let's create a script tag within the part of our Create Razor view marked with the @ symbol, followed by the section name here. Note that the code that we are about to write will later be put into its own script file. For now, we just want to see how the jQuery UI DatePicker widget will look in our web application. So the code we are writing here is temporary. So within the curly brackets demarcating a script section within the Create view, let's write jQuery code to wire up the jQuery UI DatePicker widget to the DateTime item released field. As you can see, the code to do this is very simple. Note that we have included a class selector within brackets here. The CSS class we are using as a selector is named DatePicker. So in order to wire up our DatePicker widget with a specific field, we need to include the DatePicker CSS class within the relevant input control element, like this. As you can see, the code to wire up our third-party jQuery UI DatePicker widget is very basic. So let's run the code. And look at that, our DatePicker widget pops up as soon as we give the focus to the DateTime item released field. Great, but we have two problems here. One of which is that the user can still access the browser's default DatePicker by pressing this button included within the date field. The other problem is that when we pick a date from our jQuery UI DatePicker widget, we are getting an undesirable result. We can dispense with the ASP4 tag helper for the DateTime item released input element and wire up this field to the DateTime item released field manually, i.e., rather than using the tag helpers, which will result in the appropriate HTML attributes being automatically included in the relevant input element, we can manually include the relevant HTML attributes. So when the ASP4 tag helper is used, because the DateTime item released property is of the datetime type, the runtime will render the input field with its type attribute set to a value of date, which is the attribute that tells the browser to implement its default DatePicker widget. Let's delete the ASP4 tag helper. Let's include a type attribute in the relevant element and set its value to text. Let's set the name attribute to the name of our field, which must be the name of the relevant property that has been implemented in the relevant model, i.e., the category item model. So let's set the name attribute to datetime item released. For good measure, let's also set the ID attribute. So the ID attribute must be set to the same value as we have just set for the name attribute. Let's run the code. Great, that is working as expected. We no longer have access to the browser's default DatePicker widget, which is what we want. When we select a date from our jQuery UI DatePicker widget, it works as expected. The date we select from the DatePicker is represented within the appropriate text field. Great. So we want our date format to be consistent for all views within our web application. Let's say that our requirement states that the format for the datetime item released field should be YYYY-MM-DD. So let's implement this in our code. Let's start with the index view for the category item entity. So one way we can achieve this is by appropriately declaring the display format attribute against the datetime item released property in the category item model class like this. Let's run the code. Great. So let's say that we also want the datetime item released field to default to today's date on the create razor view. We'll write the code to return today's date from the datetime item released property within the category item class first, and then address the date format for this field after we have completed the code for this. So let's add code within the category item model class like this to return today's date from the datetime item released property, if a date has not been explicitly set for this property. So if the datetime item released property has not been set, return today's date. So let's open the relevant create view and include a value attribute within the datetime item released control and set the value attribute to the relevant model object's datetime item released property. So remember, we want our date format to be consistent across all views. We have now written code to ensure that the index view displays the datetime item released field in the specified date format. We need to do the same for this field in the create razor view. So let's write code to ensure that the default date value in the datetime item released field adheres to the specified format. We can achieve this by calling the toString method on the datetime item released property, which is of type datetime, and passing in the desired date format as a string to the toString method like this. Note that if we had left the HTML input field for the datetime item released field with its type attribute set to date, we could have set a property named apply format in edit mode to true when we declared the display format attribute against the date time item released property in the category item model. For reasons we have already discussed, we are not using the ASP4 tag helper within the date time item released input tag element anymore. We can use the toString method to specify the relevant date format for the date time item released field value in this case. So we are now specifying the date format in more than one place within our code, which is undesirable. Bad programming practice. This is a clear violation of the principle of dry. Don't repeat yourself. So, to fix this, we can configure our date format in a central location and modify the code accordingly. We'll discuss configuration in a later tutorial. For now, let's flagrantly violate the principle of dry. But with the knowledge that we must address configuration for our web application at an appropriate point in the future. Right, let's run the code. Great, but when we select a date value from our date picker, our date format is not consistent with the date format specified in our requirement. It is not consistent with the date format that we now have displayed on the index view for the category item entity, or the default date value that we have now included within the datetime item released field in the create view. So we are able to include customization options for our jQuery UI DatePicker widget by passing in an object containing our customization values to the DatePicker here. So let's pass in a JavaScript object that includes a date format property set to the date format specified in our requirement. So note that the date format is written differently for the DatePicker widget when compared to the way we have specified the date format using C# code. This is an issue we'll address in a later tutorial when we deal with configuration. Let's run the code. Excellent. So we also want to integrate our jQuery UI DatePicker functionality in the Edit Razor view for the category item entity. So we don't want to repeat the code we have just written in the Create Razor view for the Edit Razor view. So let's create a new JavaScript file named DatePicker and save it to the JS directory, which is a directory that is part of the directory structure in our web application. Let's copy the relevant code from our Create Razor view and paste the code into our new DatePicker JavaScript file. Let's set a reference to our DatePicker JavaScript file within our Create view, like this. Let's include the same reference within the relevant Edit view, like this. Let's modify the date time item released input control like we did in the relevant Create view. Let's run the code. Excellent. Let's say that in our requirement, there is a specification where we need to limit a user's input for the date time item released field to a date value between today's date and 2 months into the future. So to achieve this, we can set two properties on the appropriate options JavaScript object passed into the DatePicker. These two properties are named MinDate and Maxdate. So let's test this. Let's first set the MinDate property to today's date. Let's run the code. Great, so the user is now unable to select a date for this field that is in the past. The user can only select today's date or a future date. So how can we set the Maxdate property appropriately to 2 months into the future, so the user is unable to select a date from our DatePicker that is more than 2 months into the future? We can achieve this by creating a JavaScript function that contains code that will return a date based on the addition of a number of months passed in to the relevant function. We can then set the return value from this function to the Maxdate property for our DatePicker widget. So let's create this JavaScript function and let's name it add_subtract_months. This function accepts two arguments. The first argument will be the JavaScript date object, and the second argument will be a number of months to be added or subtracted from the date argument passed into the first parameter. So the first line of code sets a variable named month to an integer value representing the month for the date passed into the first parameter. So this will be a value from 0 to 11. So January is represented as the number 0, February is represented as the number 1, March is represented as the number 2, and so on. The second line of code adds the number passed into the second parameter, so a number of months to add or subtract from the date passed into the first parameter, to the month represented by the value in the month variable. The result of this addition is assigned to a variable named milliseconds. This value in milliseconds represents the date we are going to return from this function. JavaScript stores dates as the number of milliseconds since January the 1st, 1970, 00:00:00 UTC. So 0 time in JavaScript is the date January the 1st, 1970, 00:00:00 UTC. The third line of code in our function resolves the value represented in milliseconds and returns this value to the calling code. If you don't understand this function straight away, please don't worry. The only thing you really need to know here is that this function will return a JavaScript date object based on the date object passed into the first parameter plus the value representing a number of months passed into the second parameter. Note that if a negative number is passed into the second parameter, an appropriate subtraction operation will be performed. So, a date in the past relative to the date passed into the first parameter will be returned from this function in the case where a negative number is passed into the second parameter. Okay, so let's call our add_subtract_months function in our DatePicker code to calculate the Maxdate property value. So let's add 2 months to the current date like this. Excellent. So the user can now only pick a date between today's date and 2 months into the future. Ideally, the number 2 should be configured centrally rather than be hard-coded like this. We'll deal with all configuration-related issues in a later tutorial. So, the last item we can address in this video is that we can clean up our code even further. So to do this, let's create a new JavaScript file named dateFunctions. Let's cut and paste our add_subtract_months function to the dateFunctions JavaScript file. Let's create a new partial view within the shared directory in the default area, and let's name our partial view _datescriptsPartial. Let's include references to the dateFunctions JavaScript file and the DatePicker JavaScript file within the _datescriptsPartial view. So we can now include date functionality within any of our admin Razor views by appropriately including a reference to this partial view. So let's remove our references to the relevant JavaScript file and replace these references with a reference to the _datescriptsPartial view, like this. Let's test the code. Let's tidy up our code a little bit. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It will be greatly appreciated. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider donating. I've included a PayPal link below in the description. You can, of course, support the channel by subscribing, and please ring the bell so that you'll be notified of future content. Please share this video with anyone you feel may benefit from its content. If you have any questions regarding this course so far, please include them in the comments section and I'll get back to you as soon as I am able. I really enjoy engaging with you in the comments section, so please feel free to share your thoughts with me in the comments section. The latest code can be found on GitHub. A link to the relevant GitHub repository has been included below in the description. Thank you and take care.